Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
Welcome to another episode of A Nation of Taxpayers. It is, of course, the podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance. I'm your host, Duncan Barkes. Alongside me this week is Research Director of the TPA, Darwin Friend. Good to see you.
Hello, Duncan.
Welcome back to the podcast. The last time you and I were on a podcast, it was in quite a blustery Southend.
Yeah, it's quite a different scenario, but it's good to be back.
Yeah, and we're in the recording studio for our TPA podcast, so good to see you in a less windy situation. And our guest this week is the economist Tim Congdon CBE, one of the world's leading monetary analysts, advised the 1979 to 1997 Conservative government on economic policy, and I think it's fair to say, Tim, a wise man.
Yes, indeed. I'm even wiser now than I was then in my 40s. So
excellent. And I'm hoping we can tap into your wiseness. Is that a word? Wiseness? Wisdom's the word I'm looking for. Thank you, Darwin. Over the next 30 minutes or so. Obviously, we're counting down to the budget on the 26th of November. We always record this early in the week. And I mean, this is something we've always done with this particular podcast. And I always make that point because by the time you listen to this, you may well have seen further headlines and further speculation and further leaks about what Rachel Reeves might be delivering on the 26th of November. First off, Tim, I just wanted to get your assessment really of how you would define our current state of play economically.
Rather sad.
Yeah.
Britain had serious economic problems in the 1970s when I was a very young man in my 20s. And I can remember the IMF visit in 1976 and things like that, winter discontent and rubbish in the streets. And then there was a good government. There was a government from 79 to 97, which, as you kindly said, I'd advised.
Yep.
And many good things were done. And by the end, being the sick man of Europe in the mid-1970s, by the 1990s, we were looking in pretty good shape compared with our neighbours. What's going on at the moment is, in many ways, a return to the 1970s, and that's how bad things are going.
How do you think we ended up here? I mean, ultimately, if you had to pin the blame on, is it one person we should be blaming? Or is it a succession of ill-informed, ludicrous decisions?
All these European countries, not just Britain, but all these countries have problems that go back decades, and perhaps even really to socialism. Started, I suppose, in the early 19th century, Marx, Engels, and this way of thinking that the state should plan the economy, run our lives because it knows better than we in our own interests, persuaded many people in the 20th century that it was the way forward. It's difficult to believe now, but there were I can remember them, 1950s and 60s, when I was growing up. People thought that Soviet Russia was the future.
Yeah.
Now, these kind of people are much less evident nowadays, but that strain of thought remains important, particularly, may I say, in the universities. Young people go through universities, they get affected by this way of thinking. So there's the battle with the free market,
okay,
with as I put it, in the decade of the 1980s, with Ronald Thatcher and Margaret Reagan, when in my view, good things were done. In the view, say, of Ed Miliband or others, that no, they think that what the 1980s were a period of wickedness. Sorry, it was the 1980s rescued us from the 1970s that led to the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century when Britain looked good. And I'd say it's trying to understand its ideas ultimately, and its ideas, socialism, Marxism, they continue to taint public life across the Western world.
You said something really interesting there, and forgive me because I was in the process of interrupting you. You talked about the universities and how people get infected, if you like, or affected. Would you go so far as to say that maybe people become indoctrinated?
Young people want a better world,
yeah,
which is great. They haven't had experience of the world. Mm-hmm. And many of them can be persuaded that they should help others. I think we should help others, of course. But self-help is important too, and so is individual freedom. And what happens all through the 20th century and now in the 21st century, there's continuing duel of ideas between socialism and individualism freedom. Obviously, I'm very much on the individualistic freedom side, but it's a never-ending battle.
Darwin, you're nodding away there. I mean, anything there that you disagree with?
It's hard to disagree with anything that really Tim said. And the concerning thing is that we kind of went through that period in the 70s, which Tim mentioned, and then kind of came back from that in the 80s and then the 90s as well. But then our current crop of politicians, many of them who would have gone to university in that period, seem to want to take us back to that. And it seems to be the current issue that we have in our politics right now is the government that we have and a lot of the leading lights in politics we have pretty much just want to drag us back, and it's almost like they haven't learned the lessons of history that I think so many of the public have, which is that you cannot simply rely on the state to deliver everything. Yes, the state needs to deliver some public services which are in the good of everybody, but ultimately when you try and make the state do everything for everyone all of the time, ultimately it's going to do nothing that it does very well at all.
That's a really interesting point that Darwin makes, Tim, which is it appears, you can look at history, you can see the mistakes that were made, but there does seem a reluctance to learn from those mistakes.
Can I pick up something you said? I'm sorry, I'm not going to answer your question,
No, it's fine.
which is perhaps a bit rude. But public services. Look, what do you mean by that? Do you mean, for example, education and health? These are not public services. They are services from some individuals to other individuals, which can be organized in a market context without the state. And in Britain's great days, 19th century, that was how things were done. Of course, there are lots of charities. People did help each other. There was all sorts of ways of alleviating ignorance and bad health and so on. But it was done on an individual basis. These are not public services. And I think it's very important. What I believe in is that, in modern democratic society, you should be redistributing to the poor, but actually these services can be provided by the market, and then we can have a much smaller state and much lower taxes.
You wouldn't disagree with that, would you?
No, overall, not at all. I think the general point I was trying to make is that there are some services I think that everyone generally agrees the government probably should provide. But yes, I quite agree with Tim. There are plenty of services.
And maybe they've now got into the mindset of expecting the government to do it. Particularly if you talk about the NHS, people have become, it's almost people are conditioned. And we see it with the current Labour government. We've seen with some of the what I call the pitch rolling on the run up to this budget on the 26th of November, Rachel Reeves and other MPs starting to kind of like, if you like, seed the tray, which is, well, we have to have tax increases because the NHS needs more money. Has our society, Tim, become too conditioned when we talk about public services, particularly the NHS, that actually people feel it has to be the government, the state that provides it? The idea that you've outlined, rightly, that the market could do it, is almost an alien concept.
Well, let's be clear, there are private education in Britain. Curiously, they're called public schools, but it's private education. And there's also, of course, a large private health sector, which people paid for partly by insurance, but in fact, a lot of it's just paid out of pocket. Let's also be clear that I remember the 1950s, we took it that the state would look after our optical, ophthalmic care, and also look after dentistry.
Yes.
They've both been privatized in practice.
Yes.
So these things are not cast. They're not fixed in. They're not cast in stone. They're. The question is really the sustainability of the state we have, because in Britain the ratio of government spending to GDP has risen from the lows by about 10%, and in the last 2 years since 2019, before COVID, risen by about 5% of GDP. These are large numbers. Yeah. And we've got an aging population, more pensions, more health requirement. So problems are not unique to us. High taxes, low growth, the European problem, of which we are an example.
So that's the diagnosis. We'll get to what the the solution or the medicine might be a little bit later on in this podcast. Let's get your view on the 14 years of a Conservative government. I hesitate there because, of course, in 2010 it was coalition with the Lib Dems, it was Conservative-led, and then, of course, we had the elections in 2015, 2017 and 2019, various Conservative leaders, Conservative prime ministers and chancellors. The Conservatives get a lot of flack at the moment, and many would say rightly so, for saying, well, you're saying this now, but you didn't do anything with your 14 years in power. How would you rate the 14 years of the Conservative government that we witnessed?
It was a dreary, unimpressive government. It varied. I would say in education, actually, generally, it was a success. Britain moved up the league tables. Yep. And actually, the ratio of education spending to GDP fell in that period. It may surprise you, but it did, not least, by the way, by very large cuts in spending on the university sector. So education was actually, to me, an area of achievement. But then you go through things like health, well, no suggestion of radical reform. You go through things like pensions. The Thatcher government wanted deep down to privatise pension care, to privatise pension provision, to make people think they had their own wealth and they could live off that wealth in retirement, and they didn't have to depend upon the state. Instead, we had the triple lock, which kept the ratio of pension spending to GDP rising. That was partly because of the Lib Dems, by the way, but things like macro policy really my scene. The previous government, the 79-97 government, committed in its second half to a balanced budget. Balanced budget meant no growth of public debt. That meant the ratio of debt to GDP fell. That meant spending on debt interest, most useless kind of public spending, was actually reduced substantially in that 97 Tory government. Actually, it wasn't too bad in the 2010-2024 government, but they were darn lucky because of the idiotic bond yields we had in 20 and 2021, and in fact had a large growth of the public debt. We're now having a surge in debt interest costs. As I say, the most useless, silly kind of public spending, which frankly just, these modern liberal democracies, all these clever people, for God's sake, can't we get rid of public debt and end this nonsense of taxing people to pay them debt interest? Not a nonsense.
I like the word nonsense. Thank you for using it. Darwin, your assessment or your take on two things. One, what Tim has just said, but also the 14 years of a Conservative-led government where a lot of critics of the Tories say you could have done so much, we could be living in a very different country. What's your take?
Yeah, well, just on that second question first, I guess, is that I think we had politicians and quite often so many changes of government where we didn't get new leaders coming in who had a bold vision for what the country should be like and what they wanted to see the country be. Tim obviously advised a Conservative period of administration where we did have big characters in politics who are willing to make difficult decisions during their terms of office because they weren't thinking about the election 4 years from now. They were thinking about the election 4 years from now, but they weren't thinking about immediate political costs of making some difficult decisions, because in the long term, the benefits would outweigh those short-term political costs. And in terms of what Tim said, I mean, I can't agree with him more. Debt is one of the areas I'm most interested in as a topic, and debt interest, he's absolutely right. It's such a complete waste of money that we're now spending consistently £100 billion a year on debt interest alone. That's one of the largest spending areas for the government. And even when we talk about public services, for example, we spend, I believe it was around about 180 billion, 190 billion on NHS England in the last year. We're spending over half of that as well, then on debt interest alone as well. And all it's doing is to just pay off government's borrowing decisions from previous years, which is just governments effectively not having the courage to actually deal with the deficit. I think that's the biggest problem.
Here. A lot of the debt is owned by foreigners. So we are in fact taxing ourselves to pay debt interest to ourselves again, which is pretty idiotic, but also paying debt interest to foreigners.
Yeah.
We should get rid of this public debt. Can I just, on this theme, I'm really known as UK's, I suppose, leading monetarist economist. Yes. That's my claim to fame. And monetarists and the Keynesians have these long-standing debates. The Keynesians believe that if you raise taxes, but above all, please reduce government spending, that you reduce the budget deficit. They call this deflationary. Mm-hmm. It's supposed to depress the economy. What a lot of nonsense. We proved in the 1981 budget that you can cut the budget deficit substantially even in a recession and the economy recovers. Just go through the history. There is no relationship between the change in the budget deficit and the change in economic activity. Keynesianism is a load of twaddle. It's rubbish. But in our universities, generation after generation of students since 1945, particularly really since the Samuelson textbook of 1948, all these generations have been taught this rubbish about cuts in the budget deficit, which will stop the growth of debt, stop the growth of debt interest. They've been taught that this is deflationary and depresses the economy. This is utterly wrong, and may I just say, this is part of my campaign for monetarism, is that we need to maintain all the time strong public finances.
So, sorry, John.
1 second, Duncan. I was just going to say, I'd be interested also to get Tim's view on kind of this new phenomenon that has occurred in recent years of modern monetary theory as well, which I debate with them on broadcast several times, and quite often what they will say is that you don't have to worry about the debt at all, because all it really is the government, because it's a fiat economy, as in we have our own currency, they can just print more money, and that will just be able to fund whatever we want to spend money on, and it will also mean that we don't have to worry about the debt at all. I mean, I'd be interested to get your view on modern monetary theory as well as Keynesianism.
There's the Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy, wasn't Rome, wasn't an empire. Modern monetary theory, it's not modern. It's not really much to do with money. It's to do with fiscal policy. And to call it a theory is to I'm afraid, to mock the idea of serious analysis. It's a load of junk. If you want to see what happens with the application of that kind of thinking, go to Venezuela or Bolivia.
Yeah.
And that's all one needs to say. It's rubbish.
Yeah.
Let's get your take on the first budget that was delivered by Rachel Reeves last October. I remember very clearly where I was. I was sitting in this room with some TPA colleagues, and we recorded a podcast straight after. And it became very clear very quickly the impact it would have on business with the rise in national insurance and paid by employers, and of course the national living wage or the minimum wage going up, call it whatever you will. When you watched the budget or you looked at what was delivered, what was your initial take on what she had done?
Well, it probably seems rather unkind again, but I didn't watch the budget, and I don't watch budget statements. Right. I'm in my mid-70s. Yeah. It sounds awful, but I've seen it all, frankly. Right. The problems of the modern European state, are all over these countries, and they go back decades, and they'll probably be with us for decades to come. And that we're really just talking about, well, there's quite important to discuss in that context, but if I could put it in a nutshell, the problem here is that we had Thatcher, we had New Labour, we then had this rather unimpressive government from 2010 to 2024. We've now got this another Labour government, where what's happening is that old Labour has taken over New Labour.
Yeah.
This large Labour majority means that the left drives what the government does. And the problem with old Labour is it'll take us back to the 1970s.
Yes.
So I think Rachel Reeves, by the way, is a bright lady. She fully understands that if they run a large budget deficit, they'll increase the debt, they'll increase the debt interest. She knows all that. She worked at the Bank of England. She understands if large budget deficit is going to be financed, they finance it at the long end in a responsible way. That will particularly push up the debt interest. They can borrow from the banks, and that will create money, which will cause inflation. She understands all that. And then, poor lady, I should say, sorry, she's faced with this situation where, she's a technocrat, basically. She's not really much of a politician. And she has to face these stupid people on the left who aren't being controlled by the Prime Minister, who's always travelling abroad.
Yeah.
So, no, but you really need here, and may I just say that in the second half of the 74-79 Labour government, they did this because they had to.
Yes.
It was under Callaghan and Healey. Callaghan Prime Minister and Healey was Chancellor Exchequer. The two together battled to keep the left under control, to keep spending down.
Yeah.
And that's what they've got to do again. Otherwise, this Labour government will be one of the most catastrophic in British history.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I have to answer a question about the budget. What I've tried to do is to set out the larger background.
What you said dwarfs everything. It dwarfs my question.
The budget last year and then the budget this year, when we think about them, and as I say, I mean, poor lady, she's got to face not a reformed new Labour Party, but an unreformed old Labour Party, which is spending like Billy O.
Yeah. So she's in hostage to the left of her party. Darwin, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to agree with Tim again. Like, realistically, what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor now need to do is actually take those difficult political decisions and face down their backbenchers. Yeah. Really, last year at the budget, and I imagine what we're going to get again this year, according to all of the reports that we've had so far, is going to be more austerity for taxpayers. They always like to talk about austerity in terms of spending cuts, rather than it simply being that we get our books balanced, really. Yes. And so what we saw last year is we had employer NI hiked, and they said that, that's not a tax on working people. No. We haven't broken our manifesto promise of not raising NI, income tax or VAT, but they never really seem to want to answer the second question is, well, who do they think pays employer NI, the hike that they cause? Businesses aren't just some sort of faceless organisation that's magically creates money and then gives it to the Treasury in taxes. They're people, and they're people making money through profit and other revenue raising options. And what that means is that by taxing them further, either those additional costs, they're not just going to be consumed by the business. What they're going to be done is they're going to be added to the cost of goods and services provided by that business. Yeah. So consumers of those services will have to pay more, or what will happen is the employees of that business will have to face lower wages as a result of that. And so rather than constantly talking about spending, and if we actually restrain public spending, that's austerity, what we need to be talking about is tax rises and how that's austerity for taxpayers, because you're taking away more of their hard-earned cash. Yeah,
and I just rolled into that, actually. It has an impact and opportunity, particularly if you start looking at the employment rights bill that's still going through Parliament, because not only, as you identified, does it make it more expensive for the employer to hire someone, but if you're a youngster as well, you're going to not get those opportunities. One, because it's going to cost more to hire you, and two, with this legislation, actually a lot harder to get rid of you as well. So, it pummels the youth of today in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's an ideological thing, or maybe they just don't really care about the impacts of their policies. But you look at it, employer NI hike, minimum wage rise, the employer rights bill, they seem to just think they can do anything they want to businesses and there'll be no consequences. And then they're surprised when successful businesses and entrepreneurs move to the Middle East or other countries around the world in order to avoid the high taxes that they're imposing on them.
Tim, I get the sense from what you've said so far on this episode that unless Rachel Reeves is really prepared to confront those on the left of her party, nothing will really change, right? In terms of...
I think it'll be another 3.5 years of slide.
Okay.
The interesting question to me, because I don't. Some people say this government won't last its term. I think it will, because they've got such a vast majority. Yes. The really interesting question is what happens afterwards. Yeah. And will the presumably going to be a reform government or a reform Tory coalition? Will that be a resumption of the Thatcher Revolution, or will that be another round of what we saw from 2010 to 2024? That seems to me to be the really interesting question here.
Look, I don't know if you've seen my questions, because that's one of the things I want to ask you about where we might be heading and what you would like to see, given what we might end up with as a government, either reform or a reform Tory coalition. Let's get on to that in a second, because our listeners would love to hear your thoughts on what an economic policy might look like under a different leadership. But very quickly, just focusing a little bit on where we're heading on the 26th of November, one of the things that's been trailed quite widely in the media in the last couple of weeks is this, they use this awful phrase, 2 up, 2 down, right? So it's about increasing income tax by 2 pence, but then reducing national insurance by 2 pence. That's one of the things that Rachel Reeves has apparently looking at. Would that make any difference in your view? Would it be a wise move? Or is it just moving the deck chairs around on the deck of the Titanic?
And you ask me these questions of detail about what may or might have happened in this budget run. I always want to come back to larger picture.
No, I know, but
can I just say here that one of the measures that's been touted in this is that Rachel Reeves is worried about the cost of living, inflation, I assume. Inflation is caused by excessive growth of the quantity of money. Yeah. The quantity of money is lots of bank deposits, in essence. the banking system grows if there's too large a budget deficit and then the deficit is financed from the banks, or it grows because there's new lending to the private sector. A large budget deficit, maybe due partly to tax cuts, is a permanent threat to monetary control. What is being talked about to deal with this so-called cost of living problem is a cut in VAT on energy.
Yeah.
That is just stupid. It is a one-off cut in the price level. It isn't really anything to do with inflation. It's just a one-off cut in the price level, leading to a permanent increase in the budget deficit relative to otherwise would have been, and therefore an entrenchment of the problem of keeping inflation down over the medium and long run. Just an utterly stupid policy. Now, in the 1990s, I knew people in the Treasury at that time, also 1980s. They would not have contemplated doing something so stupid because they'd have understood the argument I was saying. My guess is today in the Treasury, there is nobody who has the faintest idea what the quantity of money is or what it means to the economy. We are in that kind of problem.
So let's focus on the solution, if there is one, and go back to something that you started talking about earlier, that our next government, on the basis that Labour do last the course on the side of their majority, which is the point you made, and the next government is either a reform government or a conservative/reform coalition, what kind of radical surgery would you like to see economically? Something that is going to be red meat to our listeners to this podcast, but more importantly, get this country out of the situation it's currently in.
Well, can I first of all just my own hobby horse, if you like? Well, it's an important hobby horse. It's terribly important that people in authority in the Treasury, the Bank of England and so on understand monetarism and the monetary theory of national income determination, monetary theory of inflation and so on. In the 2020s, I have been proved dramatically right. Right in spring 2020, I could see what they were doing. I said there's going to be an inflation flare-up. Yeah. Most of my profession, most of economists in this country and elsewhere expected years of deflation, disinflation. They were utterly wrong. I was right. Please, can the Bank of England and the Treasury please understand what monetarism is about? That's the first thing. Okay. And that then leads on to there must be a commitment to a balanced budget. Can I say one of the most pleasing things that's happened in the last few weeks is that Nigel Farage has said that Reform is committed to a balanced budget. I hope he makes it as strong, as emphatic as I do, but please, that's what we want. We want a AAA country. It must have AAA credit rating. We want to have a balanced budget and get that debt problem behind us. In terms of then bits and pieces of the budget on the 26th of November, well, I want, as long as we understand the larger picture,
yes,
I think public spending can be reduced substantially relative to GDP, and the state can still carry out its role of helping the less well off, which I fully respect. And this then means that we should try to redistribute as much today, much in the future as we do today. Absolutely, you want to help the less well off. Still, the government spending can be reduced substantially by 10 or 15% of GDP. That is what the next government should try to do. I wish they could think about things like this on 26th of November. They haven't got a clue.
Darwin, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think we need to return to a primary surplus. As Tim mentioned, we haven't had one really for, 25 years almost now, I think it was. At the start of the 2000s, we last had one, and we need to really rein in spending. I mean, that needs to be the first priority of this government at this budget, is to start reining in spending, and also of any future government as well, because we are... we've currently got a deficit of, I believe, 2.2% in the last financial year. We are just spending too much. And I think what Tim's actually outlined there, of reining in spending by 10 percentage points of GDP, something akin to that. People seem to think that takes us back to the 1700s or something like that. It takes us back to about 10 or 15 years ago. It's hardly like we're going back to the Ice Age or something like that. And so I think a concerted effort, not just from this government, but the next government as well, to actually rein in spending and be honest with the public actually about this is what the state can deliver, and this is what we can deliver with an actual balanced budget as well, is only fair for taxpayers who are the ones funding all of this at the end of the day.
Does come down to honesty, doesn't it?
Yep,
it does.
Absolutely.
It's been a fascinating conversation. Tim, thank you. Before we end this episode, it would be amiss of me not to ask you, given your experience over the decades, because some of our listeners are quite politically, I'd call them with respect political anoraks, okay? You know, they love their nuggets of historical past. Given your experience and having advised the government between 79 and 97. Which politician or which chancellor impressed you the most?
Curiously, probably Nigel Lawson. I fell out with Nigel, I'm afraid, pretty badly. He dropped money supply targets, which was a disastrous thing to do. Having said that, he was most in tune with the kind of thinking that I really believe in on free markets. And I also think, by the way, that Kenneth Clarke was a wonderful chancellor. I got on very well with Ken Clarke on a personal basis, and I think it's a shame he didn't become Prime Minister, but he was too committed to the European cause.
It's been a great conversation. Darwin, thank you. Tim, thank you for joining us on this episode. It has been A Nation of Taxpayers. It is, of course, the podcast on Taxpayers Alliance. Do check out our archive, or that's our archive that goes back over a year. Weekly episodes talking to plenty of fascinating people. Do check it out. You'll find it on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, if you'd like to send us an email, maybe suggest a future guest or a topic of conversation, the email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com.